I realized something was wrong the moment I saw them. Two HOA security guards were parked directly against my fence, not driving by, not checking anything, parked, chairs out, cooler open, lights aimed straight at my property. I walked up and asked a simple question. Why are you here? One of them didn't even look at me at first. He stayed seated and said, calm and flat, this is HOA land now, we're just making sure you don't cause problems. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a patrol. They had set up camp. They spoke like ownership had already changed, like decisions had already been made, like I was the problem for even asking. My mind moved fast. Confusion first, then anger, then disbelief so sharp it almost felt unreal. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand paperwork. I wanted to tell them to move. Instead, I stopped myself, because if they were bold enough to camp on my fence like they owned it, I had to ask myself something far more dangerous. What were they planning to do next? I'm not the kind of person who looks for fights. I've always believed that if you follow the rules, keep your paperwork clean, and treat people with respect, problems usually stay small. I'm a quiet landowner. I bought this property years ago, long before the HOA started acting like it owned everything in sight. That fence isn't random. It sits exactly where the survey says it should. Straight line. Recorded boundary. No guessing. No shortcut. It marks the edge of land I've paid taxes on, maintained and protected for years. For me, it represents something simple but important. Peace. Privacy. A place where no one tells you how to live. I've always respected boundaries, mine and everyone else's. That's why the HOA notices over the last year never sat right with me. They were vague, poorly worded, always pushing, never explaining, claims without proof, authority without limits. Little by little, they started acting bigger, more confident, more aggressive. Like they were testing how far they could go. Standing there that night, looking at those guards, I realized this wasn't sudden. This had been building for a long time. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes after I stepped back inside, another vehicle pulled up. This one wasn't security. This was personal. The HOA president stepped out, clipboard under her arm, smile already fixed on her face like she'd practiced it in the mirror. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask how I was doing. She walked straight toward the fence and spoke before she even reached it. This fence is encroaching, she said, loud enough for the guards to hear. We've already confirmed that. Her tone was calm, but not kind. It was rehearsed, confident, the kind of voice people use when they think the argument is already over. I asked her one simple question. Confirmed by who? She sighed, like I was wasting her time. By the HOA. This patrol is temporary. We're just protecting community property until this gets resolved. I looked past her at the guards. They weren't watching the road. They weren't checking anything. They were watching me. I kept my voice steady. If this is HOA land now, I'd like to see the paperwork. Written authority. A survey. Any recorded easement that shows this fence is wrong. She smiled again, tighter this time. We don't need to show you that. That was the moment I felt the shift. I asked again, slower. You're claiming jurisdiction over my property. That requires documentation. She tapped her clipboard. Legal is already involved. You'll hear from them. I noticed something then. Every time I asked for proof, she spoke in circles. No dates, no names, no references, just confidence, just pressure. One of the guards stepped closer to the fence, too close. He rested his hand on his belt, not threatening exactly, but not neutral either. Another guard repositioned himself so he was standing slightly behind me. Not enough to block me, just enough to be felt. This wasn't security behavior. This was enforcement. The HOA president pointed at my fence. According to our records, this section crosses into common area. I asked, which records? She didn't answer. She just said, the updated ones. That was the first clear red flag. Updated how? Updated when? Updated by who? I told her plainly, I've owned this land for years. The survey hasn't changed. The county hasn't changed it. If you're claiming something new, I need to see it. She tilted her head like she was dealing with a stubborn child. You don't get to approve HOA decisions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just said, then this conversation isn't going anywhere. She didn't like that. Her tone hardened. You should be careful. Non-compliance can lead to fines, access restrictions, further enforcement. I looked at the guards again. One of them smirked. Like this part was his favorite. I realized then that this wasn't about a fence. It wasn't about a boundary, it was about control, about seeing who would back down when pressure showed up in uniform and confidence. They referenced documents I had never received, surveys I had never seen, decisions I was never part of. Everything was already decided, as far as they were concerned. I felt anger rise again, hot and fast. The urge to argue, to demand answers, to tell them exactly how wrong they were, and then I stopped, because arguing would give them what they wanted: noise, emotion, something to point at later and say I was difficult. So I did the opposite. I pulled out my phone. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a show of it. I just started documenting. The guards, the vehicles, the lights, the exact position of the fence. The HOA president speaking without evidence. She noticed and frowned. Recording HOA operations isn't appropriate. I looked at her and said calmly, neither is camping on private property without authority. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she told the guards they'd be staying for now, then turned and walked back to her vehicle like this was finished. The guards sat back down, chairs, cooler, lights still aimed inward. I stood there for a moment longer, not saying a word. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them with anger. I wasn't going to fight them with arguments. I was going to document everything. After they left, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of them, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. Everything they said replayed over and over. The confidence. The way they spoke like ownership had already changed hands. The way they referenced documents I had never seen. So the next morning, I started where I always start when something doesn't feel right: paper. I pulled out my original deed first, the same one I'd reviewed when I bought the property. I read it slowly, line by line, even though I already knew what it said. Legal description, parcel number, boundary calls. Nothing vague. Nothing open to interpretation. Then I went deeper. County plat maps, historical records, archived filings. I compared them to the survey I had framed in my office, the one done years before the HOA even existed. I went outside and walked the fence line myself, matching each corner to the survey stakes, still buried in the ground. I took photos, close ones, wide ones, timestamp. The more I checked, the clearer it became. The HOA boundary didn't match the county record, not even close. Their so-called common area stopped short of my fence by several feet. And the fence itself? It had been there long before the HOA was formed. It wasn't something I added quietly or recently. It was established, recorded, visible in older aerial images. There was no gray area, which meant one thing: they knew they were wrong. That's when the pressure increased. The next night, the guards were back. Same spot, same setup, lights aimed inward again. This time they stayed later. Sometimes all night, sometimes switching shifts like it was an actual post. By the third day, notices started appearing, taped directly to my fence. Bright paper. Official-looking language. Words like violation, temporary authority, and pending enforcement. Still no documents attached. Neighbors stopped waving. A couple of them pulled me aside quietly and told me the HOA had warned them not to get involved, that they were told to stay away until the issue was resolved. One neighbor said the HOA president told them I was being uncooperative. That word stuck with me. Uncooperative. Not wrong. Not in violation, just uncooperative. At night the lights made sleep difficult. Not impossible, but restless. Every time I turned over I saw the glow through the window. My family noticed it too. They asked questions I didn't have simple answers for. Are they allowed to do that? Can they come closer? What happens next? I kept my voice calm. I told them the truth. I didn't know yet, but I was working on it. During the day I stayed methodical. I logged every patrol, every vehicle, every notice. I photographed the fence every morning and every night. I saved copies of every HOA message, every email, every vague warning. What struck me most wasn't what they did. It was how they did it. No formal service, no certified letters, no clear timelines, just presence, just pressure, just enough authority to make people uncomfortable, but not enough to stand up to scrutiny. That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't enforcement. If it were enforcement, they would have led with documents, surveys, county filings, clear steps, clear remedies. This was intimidation. They wanted me tired, isolated, doubting myself. They wanted me to make a mistake, to lash out, to remove the fence on my own just to make it stop. And that told me everything I needed to know, so I slowed down even more. I made copies of everything and stored them in more than one place. I backed up photos. I wrote down exact times and exact words. I stopped responding emotionally and started responding only with written requests for proof. Every time they sent a notice, I asked for the document it referenced. Every time they mentioned updated records, I asked where those records were filed. They never answered those questions. Instead, the patrols continued. The notices multiplied, the warnings grew sharper, and with every day that passed, my confusion faded completely. What replaced it was clarity. They weren't stronger than me, they were louder, and I was building something far more dangerous to them than an argument. I was building a case. The first fine arrived 3 days later. No envelope, no certified mail, just a printed notice taped to my fence like a warning sign. It said I owed money for continued non-compliance and referenced an HOA rule number I'd never heard of. No explanation, no proof, just an amount and a deadline. By the end of the week, there were more. Each one came faster than the last. Higher amounts, sharper language. Words like escalation and enforcement phase started appearing. Still no documents attached, still no survey, still no explanation of how my fence suddenly violated anything. Then came the cease and desist. That one was slid under my gate, folded like it mattered. It claimed I was interfering with HOA operations by challenging authorized patrols. It warned me not to speak to guards directly. It warned me not to modify the fence. It warned me that removal could happen without further notice. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules anymore. The guards changed too. They stopped sitting back in their chairs. They stood more, moved closer. One morning I found them parked in a way that partially blocked my driveway. Not fully, just enough to make a point. When I had visitors, the guards raised their phones and took pictures, not discreetly, slowly, clearly. I asked one of them what they were documenting. He said, just activity. That word again. Vague, meaningless, dangerous. The HOA sent an email that afternoon, claiming emergency authority. They said the situation posed a risk to the community. They didn't explain what the risk was. They didn't explain how a fence that had been there for years suddenly became an emergency. But they used the word anyway. Emergency. That word changes things. It scares people. It makes neighbors step back. It makes guards feel justified. And it gives cover to actions that wouldn't survive daylight. I didn't argue. I didn't respond emotionally. I did something else. I started recording everything. Every interaction. Every notice. Every vehicle position. Every time a guard blocked access or photographed someone. I kept my phone low, calm, visible enough to be honest, not dramatic. I also started asking questions in writing. I requested the public records they claimed supported their authority. I asked for the emergency declaration. I asked for the survey that supposedly showed my fence was wrong. I asked for the date those updated records were filed. No one answered those questions. Instead, I received another fine. That's when I called a surveyor, quietly, not through the HOA, not announced, just a professional who knew county lines and didn't care about HOA politics. I also reached out to an attorney I trusted, not to file anything yet, just to ask a simple question: what does this look like to you? While I waited, I kept reviewing the documents I already had. That's when I noticed something small, almost nothing, a date that didn't sit right. A document the HOA had referenced in one of their notices finally appeared as an attachment. I stared at it longer than I should. The formatting looked off. The date didn't line up with the county filing timeline. The signature block was there, but the name didn't match the official who should have signed it at the time. It wasn't proof yet, but it was wrong. I leaned back and felt that cold clarity settle in again, the same feeling I'd had the night they camped at my fence. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was starting to look like something else entirely. And whatever it wasn't civil. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I printed the document and laid it next to the county records I already had. Same subject, same supposed authority, but the timelines didn't match. The county version showed one date, the HOA version showed another. Weeks apart, and that gap mattered. I checked the file history. The formatting was newer than it should have been. Clean. Too clean, like it had been recreated, not retrieved. That's when I stopped assuming incompetence. I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. I went back through every notice they'd sent and lined them up in order. I highlighted references. I circled rule numbers. I cross-checked each claim against actual filings. Patterns started to form. The same phrases repeated. The same vague authority cited. Always per HOA records. Never per county filing. The guards escalated again. One afternoon, I returned home to find my gate partially blocked, not locked, not chained, just positioned so it made entry awkward. Intentional without being obvious. When I stopped my vehicle, one of the guards walked over slowly and said, "You should probably cooperate before this gets more serious." I asked him what that meant. He said, "That's not up to me. I recorded it. That night, I couldn't ignore the weight of it anymore. The pressure wasn't just procedural, it was personal, designed to wear me down, to make life inconvenient enough that I'd give in quietly. My family felt it too. They stopped inviting people over, they checked the windows before turning off lights. Every small decision started revolving around those guards and that fence. That's when the surveyor called me back. He didn't hesitate. He said the boundary was clear. He said the fence was right where it belonged. He said the HOA maps he'd seen before were creative at best. His words, not mine. The attorney was more careful, but his tone changed when I mentioned the altered document. He asked me to send everything. Not just the document, everything. And when he called me back, he didn't talk about violations. He talked about exposure. He told me something I'll never forget. He said if they're representing authority they don't have, and backing it with altered paperwork, this stops being an HOA issue. I asked him what it becomes. He paused before answering. Potentially criminal. That word landed heavier than any fine they'd sent. I looked back at the timeline. The patrols, the threats, the emergency claim. The documents that didn't exist until they needed them, the way the guards acted like they were above explanation. It all fit together now. This wasn't about a fence encroaching, it was about forcing control through intimidation, hoping no one would push back hard enough to expose the foundation. And I had pushed back, quietly, methodically, with records. I stood by the fence that night and watched the guards from a distance. They looked the same, confident, comfortable, certain they were in the right. They didn't know what I knew yet. They didn't know this wasn't civil anymore. They didn't know the rules they were breaking were bigger than HOA bylaws, and they definitely didn't know that their temporary patrol had just turned into evidence. Once I understood that this could be more than an HOA dispute, I stopped reacting and started digging deeper. Not emotionally, structurally. I treated it like a timeline that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. I began with the HOA itself. I requested their original filings from the state, not summaries, not updated versions, the originals, formation documents, boundary descriptions, anything that defined what they were allowed to control and what they were not. It took time. They didn't make it easy. Some requests were ignored, others were delayed. While I waited, I moved to the county. I pulled every piece of correspondence between the HOA and county offices that I could legally obtain. Emails, letters, notes attached to applications. I wasn't looking for opinions. I was looking for consistency. That's when the cracks started to show. The county records did not match the HOA claims. Not in language, not in scope, not in authority. The boundary descriptions in the HOA paperwork were vague, almost intentionally so. Phrases like approximate and subject to interpretation appeared where exact measurements should have been. Then I found the boundary map they had been using. It wasn't stamped, it wasn't recorded, it wasn't approved, it was an internal reference map. Nothing more, yet they were treating it like law. That discovery changed everything. I went back and looked at every notice they had sent me. Every fine, every threat, every reference to common area, all of it traced back to that same unofficial map, a map that had never been validated by the county, a map that expanded HOA control without permission. Next, I looked into the patrol itself. I checked licensing requirements, property enforcement authority, what security guards were allowed to do and where. Then I cross-checked that against who they had hired. The guards weren't licensed for property enforcement. They were contracted security, observation only. No authority to block access, no authority to intimidate, no authority to act as an enforcement arm of the HOA. And yet, that's exactly what they were doing. I kept going. I spoke quietly to a neighbor I trusted. Then another. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't push. I just listened. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Others had been pressured before. Fences moved. Yards adjusted. Access voluntarily surrendered after repeated warnings. People complied because they didn't want trouble, because they didn't have time, because they assumed the HOA knew what it was doing. They hadn't. Fear started to drain out of me, replaced by something steadier, clearer. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting. I was confirming. I began organizing everything into a single file. Chronological, clean, dates first, then documents, then photos, each patrol logged, each notice photographed, each interaction time-stamped. I added names where I could, vehicle numbers, positions, exact language used. For the first time since this started, I felt calm, not because the situation was over, but because I finally understood it. They hadn't overpowered me, they had overreached, and that meant the balance was about to shift. Once the file started taking shape, I stopped feeling like I was reacting to them. I was ahead of them, every new piece of information locked into place like it had always been waiting there. The unofficial boundary map explained the confidence. The lack of approval explained the deflection. The unlicensed guards explained the intimidation tactics. Nothing about this was accidental. I requested one more set of records. Internal HOA emails related to patrol implementation. They fought that request harder than the others. Delays, objections, partial disclosures. That alone told me how important it was. When the documents finally came through, they were careful, redacted, sanitized, but even then the language gave them away. Phrases like pressure compliance, visible presence, and setting precedent appeared where enforcement procedures should have been. They weren't enforcing rules. They were manufacturing obedience. One email mentioned my property directly, not by address, but by description. Fence line dispute, priority. Another referenced holding position until compliance achieved. No reference to court, no reference to county approval, just pressure. I added those emails to the file. Then I did something I hadn't done yet. I went back to the very beginning, before the guards, before the fines. Before the cease and desist, I reviewed the first vague notice they had ever sent me. The language was soft then, suggestive, almost friendly. It wasn't enforcement, it was a test. I reached out to 2 former residents who no longer lived in the community. People who had quietly sold and moved on. They didn't want to be involved publicly, but they were willing to talk. Both told similar stories. Ambiguous notices, repeated visits, pressure that never crossed a clear legal line, but always hovered close enough to scare. Both had complied. Not because they were wrong, but because it was easier. That was the final confirmation. This was a system, a pattern, a method. By the time I finished assembling the file, it wasn't just documentation anymore, it was a narrative, start to finish, cause and effect. Action and response. Intimidation followed by silence. Silence followed by compliance. Except this time, compliance never came. I labeled each section carefully. Formation, authority, boundary, patrol, escalation, evidence, witnesses. I included photographs with timestamps, screenshots of messages, copies of notices exactly as they were posted. Nothing edited, nothing dramatized, just facts. The fear that had been sitting in my chest since the first night was gone, completely. In its place was certainty. Not arrogance, not anger, just certainty. They didn't know it yet, but the story had already turned. The HOA thought power came from confidence in uniforms and official-sounding language. They thought no one would slow down enough to check. They were wrong. And the moment I closed that file, I knew something else too. The investigation phase was over. The next step wouldn't be quiet. The notice for the emergency meeting went out fast. No details, no agenda, just a short message saying attendance was strongly encouraged due to an ongoing situation affecting the community. I knew exactly what that meant. They wanted control of the room before questions started forming on their own. When I walked in, the tone was already set. The HOA president stood at the front with 2 board members beside her. The guards were there too, standing along the wall like decorations meant to remind everyone who was in charge. Chairs filled quickly, people whispered, phones stayed down, no one wanted attention. The president opened the meeting without delay. She spoke confidently, calm, polished. She framed everything as a matter of safety and order. She said the HOA had been forced to act due to a resident's refusal to cooperate. She didn't say my name, but everyone knew. She talked for a long time. She talked about rules, about authority, about responsibility. She mentioned documents without naming them. She mentioned legal counsel without explaining what advice they'd given. Every sentence sounded official, but nothing was specific. I didn't interrupt. I sat still and waited. That seemed to bother her more than anything. After nearly 20 minutes, she finally said residents could speak. Her eyes scanned the room carefully before landing on me. "You may respond," she said, like she was granting permission. I stood up slowly. I didn't bring notes. I didn't bring emotion. I just brought questions. I asked the first one plainly. "Can you show the approved boundary map you're using to claim my fence is on HOA land?" She smiled. The same tight smile I'd seen before. "That's already been reviewed internally." I nodded. "I'm asking to see it." The room got quieter. She said the map was part of HOA records and not something distributed casually. I asked the second question, was that map ever approved by the county? She hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough for people to notice. She said the HOA didn't require county approval for internal enforcement. I asked the third question, then can you show the easement or recorded filing that gives the HOA authority past the county boundary? She shifted her weight. One of the board members leaned toward her and whispered something. She cleared her throat and said legal counsel had advised them not to share documents in an open meeting. That's when the mood changed. People started looking at each other. Not at her, at each other. I kept my voice steady. You've said this is an emergency. Emergencies require clarity. If the documents exist, showing them should settle this. She didn't answer that. Instead, she talked about decorum, about process, about not turning meetings into arguments, but no one was arguing. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone. I had just asked for proof. One neighbor raised a hand and asked why the fence hadn't been an issue for years, if it was suddenly a violation. Another asked why guards were needed at all. Someone else asked what exactly the emergency was. The president answered quickly, but not clearly. Her explanations changed slightly each time. Dates shifted, reasons shifted. The words stayed confident, but the meaning didn't stay consistent. I noticed the guards then. They weren't relaxed anymore. One of them crossed his arms. Another avoided eye contact. They didn't look like authority. They looked like they were waiting for something to go wrong. The meeting didn't explode. It didn't resolve either. The president eventually said the board would take further legal action if necessary and ended the discussion abruptly. People stood up slowly. Conversations started in low voices. No one looked satisfied. As I sat back down, I felt it clearly. The room had changed. Nothing had been decided. But doubt had entered. After the meeting officially ended, no one rushed for the door. That alone told me everything. People stayed seated. Some stood in place. Small clusters formed in corners of the room. Conversations stayed low, cautious, like no one wanted to be the first person overheard saying the wrong thing. The confidence the board walked in with hadn't followed them to the end. The HOA president gathered her papers quickly. Too quickly. One of the board members asked her something under his breath, and she shook her head before he even finished. Her smile was gone now. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was irritation mixed with concern. Several neighbors approached me, but not all at once. One at a time, quietly. The same way people had spoken to me before when the guards weren't around. They careful questions, not accusations, just questions. Why wouldn't they show the map? Have you really had that fence there the whole time? Do they actually have the right to do this? I answered the same way I had during the meeting. Calm. Factual. No opinions, no insults. Just what I knew and what I could prove. Across the room I noticed the guards again. They weren't standing together anymore. One was near the exit, another stayed close to the board. Their posture had changed, less assertive, more uncertain, like they were realizing they might be standing on the wrong side of something. One neighbor raised his voice slightly and asked the president if fines would continue during legal review. She responded without turning fully toward him. She said the HOA would act as advised. Someone else asked advised by who. That question didn't get an answer. Instead, the president said the meeting was over and reminded everyone to respect the process. Then she left. Not slowly, not confidently, just gone. The board followed. The room didn't empty right away. People talked more openly now. I heard words like unclear and rushed, and why now? No one defended the board out loud. No one said the HOA was obviously right. That was new. By the time I stepped outside, the night air felt different than it had the first time I'd seen the guards at my fence. Not light, not calmer, just charged. Like something had shifted and hadn't settled yet. The next morning, an email went out from the HOA, short, formal, careful. It stated that the board was reviewing legal options and that no further discussion would take place until advised by counsel. It warned residents not to interfere with ongoing enforcement activities. It said fines and patrols would continue as necessary, but something was missing. There were no new claims, no new authority cited, no mention of documents, just silence where confidence had been. The patrols continued, but they felt different now too. The guards didn't linger as long. They didn't reposition vehicles the same way. They didn't photograph visitors openly anymore. When neighbors passed, the guards looked away instead of staring them down. They knew they'd been seen. I added the meeting to my file. Time, location, statements made, questions avoided, contradictions noted, names of residents who spoke up, guards present, everything. I didn't feel victorious, but I didn't feel alone anymore either. The HOA had tried to control the room, to dominate the narrative, to shut questions down with confidence and legal language. And for a while, that approach had worked. But not this time. They had promised legal action. They had ended the meeting without answers, and in doing so, they'd done something far more dangerous to themselves. They'd shown everyone that when asked simple questions, they didn't have simple answers. Whatever came next, it wouldn't happen quietly. The first call didn't come from the HOA. It came from the county. I didn't celebrate when I saw the number. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was confirmation. Everything I had documented, every inconsistency, every unanswered question, had finally reached someone who didn't care about HOA politics. The county official arrived unannounced 2 days later. No uniform, no speech, just a clipboard and a calm expression. He walked the fence line slowly, stopped where the guards usually parked, and asked me one question before anything else. "Is this where they've been setting up?" I said yes. He took notes, measured distances, took his own photos. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look surprised either. He asked who had authorized the patrols. I told him exactly what I'd been told. He nodded once. That was it. Later that afternoon, another vehicle arrived. This one was marked. Law enforcement. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just present. The guards stiffened the moment they saw it. The confidence they'd carried for weeks drained out of their posture almost instantly. An officer asked them for identification and asked a question I hadn't heard anyone ask yet. "Who told you to be here?" One of the guards hesitated. He glanced toward the HOA president's house down the road. Then he said, "We were instructed to hold the line." Those exact words. The officer wrote it down. By the next morning, the licensing board got involved. I hadn't contacted them directly. Someone else had. I didn't need to guess who. When authority starts checking authority, things move fast. The guards were questioned again. Separately this time, not accusatory. Just factual. Where were you licensed? What authority were you given? What instructions were you operating under? The answers didn't match. One admitted they were told to act like enforcement even though they weren't licensed for it. Another said they were told the HOA had emergency jurisdiction and that paperwork existed to support it. When asked if they'd seen that paperwork, he said no. The file I'd built stopped being theoretical. It became evidence. The HOA president finally showed up once the situation couldn't be managed quietly anymore. She arrived confident at first, clipboard in hand like always. But when she saw county officials, licensing representatives and law enforcement all standing near the fence, her steps slowed. She asked what was going on. No one answered her immediately. The county official asked her to explain the authority under which she ordered patrols onto private property. She started confidently, referencing HOA rules and emergency powers. She mentioned documents again. Maps, records. This time, she was asked to produce them. Not later, not privately, now. She handed over a folder. The county official opened it, flipped through the pages, and stopped. He asked her where the map came from. She said it was an internal HOA document. He asked who approved it. She didn't answer. He asked if it had ever been recorded with the county. She said it wasn't required. That's when the licensing board representative spoke for the first time. "It is if you're using it to justify enforcement." The air changed. The HOA president's voice tightened. She said there must be a misunderstanding. That she was acting in the best interest of the community, that the situation had escalated because I was uncooperative. No one responded to that. Instead, the county official compared her map to the official county record. Side by side, no dramatics, just facts. The lines didn't match. The boundaries didn't match. The authority didn't exist. He looked up at her and said calmly, "This map has no legal standing." She opened her mouth to respond. And for the first time since this began, she had nothing prepared. Silence stretched longer than it should have. The HOA president tried to recover by shifting the conversation. She said the HOA had acted on advice. She said they believed the authority was implied. She said the patrols were meant to keep things calm. The county official didn't argue with her. He asked a different question. "Did you authorize guards to occupy private property?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then she said yes, but only temporarily. The officer wrote that down. The licensing board representative asked whether the guards were licensed for enforcement actions on private land. She said she assumed they were. That assumption landed hard. One of the guards looked down at the ground. Another rubbed his hands together like he wanted to disappear. Law enforcement asked the guards to step aside and answer a few questions separately. That's when the story finally unraveled. Away from the HOA president, the guards stopped speaking in generalities. One admitted they were told to stay as close to the fence as possible to apply pressure. Another said they were instructed to block access if necessary but not to touch anyone. When asked if they were told they had legal authority to do that, one guard said, "We were told the paperwork was handled." The officer asked a simple follow-up. "Did you ever see the paperwork?" No one said yes. Meanwhile, the county official kept reviewing the HOA documents. He pointed out inconsistencies calmly, almost clinically, dates that didn't align, language that didn't match official filings, a signature that appeared on a document months after the person had left that office. The HOA president tried to explain it away as a clerical issue. The county official shook his head. "Clerical issues don't create authority," he said. Neighbors had started gathering now, not formally, just drawn by the presence of officials, and the unmistakable sense that something serious was happening. Phones came out, people whispered. No one looked at me like I was the problem anymore. The licensing board representative explained, clearly and publicly, that the guards had exceeded their licensed scope, that presenting themselves as enforcement without authorization was a violation, that directing them to do so was another. The HOA president's face changed. Not angry, not defensive, just tight, like she finally understood the situation she was standing in. She said the HOA would cooperate fully. She said they would review their procedures. She said she had only been trying to protect the community. Law enforcement didn't respond to that. Instead, the officer stated that there were credible indications of trespass, false representation of authority, and an organized intimidation effort. He said those matters would be reviewed formally. That word intimidation hung in the air. I didn't speak, I didn't need to. Everything I had spent weeks documenting was now being repeated back to them by people who didn't answer to the HOA. The guards were asked to leave the property immediately. They packed up quietly, no chairs, no cooler, no lights. As they drove away, the fence looked the same as it always had. The difference was who acknowledged it. The county official turned to the HOA president one last time and said, "You had zero authority to be here." There was no argument after that. The moment the guards left, the power balance shifted completely. What had once felt like an occupied boundary suddenly looked like what it always was. A fence, a legal line, a place that didn't need defending because it had never been in question to begin with. The county official asked me to walk him through the timeline. Not as a statement, not as a complaint, just facts, dates, actions, response. I spoke slowly and clearly, the same way I'd written everything down. He followed along with my file, nodding as each piece lined up. When I finished, he closed the folder and turned to the HOA president. "You initiated enforcement without jurisdiction," he said. "You ordered occupation of private property, and you relied on documents that were never approved." She tried one last time. She said the board had acted collectively. That responsibility was shared. That she wasn't the only decision maker. The county official didn't raise his voice. "Authority doesn't diffuse responsibility," he said. The licensing board representative added that directing guards to perform enforcement duties without proper licensing exposed both the HOA and its officers to penalties. She explained it plainly so everyone listening could understand. No legal jargon, no intimidation, just reality. Law enforcement confirmed they would be opening a formal review into trespass and misrepresentation, not a threat, not a promise, a process. Neighbors had fully gathered now. Some stood across the street. Others stayed at a distance but watched closely. No one intervened. No one defended the HOA president. No one questioned the officials. For the first time, she looked around and realized she was standing alone. She asked whether the fence would need to be removed pending review. The county official answered without hesitation. No. He said the fence was legal. He said it had always been legal. He said the county records were clear and unambiguous. He said any attempt to remove it would constitute a violation. That was the moment everything collapsed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. The HOA president didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She didn't posture. She nodded once, stiffly, and said nothing. The official explained next steps. Notices would be issued. Findings would be documented. Recommendations would follow. He reminded the HOA president that cooperation was expected. When the officials left, the street stayed quiet. No patrols, no guards, no lights. Just the fence. Later that evening, the HOA sent out another email, shorter than the last, careful in its wording. It stated that patrols had been suspended, that enforcement related to the fence was on hold, that the HOA was reviewing procedures. They didn't apologize. They didn't need to. Their credibility had already collapsed. People came by after that. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before. They didn't say much, just nodded, just acknowledged what had happened. The story had traveled faster than any email. Standing there, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not anger, just quiet certainty. Because the final showdown hadn't ended with shouting or punishment in the moment. It ended with something far more permanent. The truth had replaced their authority. The days that followed felt unreal in their quiet. No vehicles parked by the fence. No radios, no footsteps, no paper notices taped where everyone could see them. The absence was louder than the patrols ever were. Then the official letters arrived, not from the HOA this time. The county issued a formal finding stating that the fence was fully compliant and lawfully placed. It referenced recorded surveys, historical plats, and prior aerial imagery, clear language, no ambiguity. The line was where it had always been. The licensing board's notice came next. It confirmed that the guards had acted outside their permitted scope and that directives had come from HOA leadership. It stated that misrepresentation of authority had occurred, consequences would follow through proper channels. Law enforcement's involvement was quieter, but no less real. Interviews were documented. Statements were preserved. The words trespass and false representation appeared in official correspondence. No drama, just process. The HOA president resigned before the board could vote. It was announced in a short message sent to residents late one evening. No explanation, no farewell, just a line stating she was stepping down effective immediately. 2 board members followed within a week. A special meeting was scheduled to appoint interim leadership. This time the room felt different. People asked questions freely. Documents were requested openly. No one accepted vague answers anymore. I didn't speak much at that meeting. I didn't need to. Everyone there already understood what had happened. The fence never moved. The HOA never mentioned it again. What stayed with me wasn't the collapse of their authority. It was how fragile it had been the entire time. Built on confidence instead of legitimacy, on pressure instead of proof, on the assumption that no one would slow down long enough to check. They had mistaken silence for agreement. They had mistaken patience for weakness. Standing at the fence one evening, I realized something else too. The moment they chose intimidation over transparency, the outcome was already decided. It just took time for the evidence to catch up. Power didn't shift because I shouted louder or pushed harder. It shifted because I documented, because I waited, because I refused to move without proof. They thought the fence was the problem. It never was. It was the line they weren't allowed to cross. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came quietly, one after another, the way real accountability usually does. The HOA's first notice came through email. Short, formal, it announced that the patrol program had been terminated effective immediately. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that it would not be reinstated. The guards were gone for good. No replacements, no temporary measures. The line they had crossed wouldn't be tested again. A week later, residents received another update. The HOA had been fined. The amount wasn't dramatic, but the reason mattered. Unauthorized enforcement actions, improper use of contracted security, failure to follow recorded boundaries. Each point spelled out in plain language. It was official now. What had happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation. Then came the resignations. First the president, then 2 board members. No speeches, no public defense, just brief announcements saying they were stepping aside in the interest of the community. The words felt hollow, but the result didn't. Their authority was gone. For the first time since this started, the fence felt different to look at, not because it had changed. It hadn't moved an inch. Same posts, same line, same place it had always been. But now it stood without pressure around it, without lights aimed inward, without anyone claiming it didn't belong. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was proof that boundaries matter, proof that documentation matters, proof that patience, when backed by facts, outlasts intimidation every time. I walked the line one evening and noticed something simple. Neighbors passed without slowing down. No one avoided eye contact. No one whispered. The tension that had lived in the space between us was gone. Nothing dramatic replaced it, just normal life returning. And that was the point. With the patrols gone and the board reshuffled, the community began to breathe again. You could feel it in small ways at first. People stopped rushing inside when cars slowed near the fence. Conversations happened out in the open instead of in half-whispers. The unspoken tension that had hung over the neighborhood for weeks slowly dissolved. Neighbors who had kept their distance before started checking in, not to gossip, just to say they were glad it was over. A few admitted they'd felt pressured in the past too, that they'd moved things, changed routines, or stayed quiet simply because it felt easier than questioning authority. Now, they were questioning it. The HOA scheduled a new meeting. This one didn't feel like the last. No guards, no rehearsed speeches, no vague emergencies. The interim board opened with something I hadn't heard from them before: documentation. They showed financial records. They explained the fines. They acknowledged mistakes without naming names. For the first time, questions weren't treated as challenges. They were treated as part of the process. Transparency had become the expectation, not the exception. Sitting there, I thought about how close I'd come to giving in early. How easy it would have been to move the fence just to make the pressure stop. How quiet compliance would have erased everything that followed. Instead, the opposite happened. By staying calm and patient, by refusing to act without proof, I'd forced the system to slow down. And once it slowed down, the truth had room to surface. I didn't feel proud in a loud way. There was no victory lap, just a steady sense of rightness, like something that had been bent out of shape was finally straight again. The fence stayed exactly where it was. Not as a challenge, not as a statement, as a boundary. And the community, finally seeing how fragile unchecked authority could be, started demanding something better. They demanded records. They demanded clarity. They demanded accountability. And this time, they knew how to ask. In the weeks that followed, life settled back into something familiar. Not perfect, just normal. And after everything that had happened, normal felt like a gift. The fence stopped being a topic of conversation. No emails, no warnings, no side comments passed along by neighbors. It stood quietly, doing exactly what it was meant to do: mark a boundary, and then fade into the background. That, more than anything, told me the fight was truly over. I thought a lot about patience during that time. Not the passive kind people confuse with weakness, but the deliberate kind. The kind where you slow everything down, refuse to be rushed, and insist that every claim be backed by something real. The kind where you don't argue louder, you document better. If I'd reacted the way we expected, angry, defensive, impulsive, this would have ended very differently. The pressure would have worked. The story would have disappeared quietly, just like it had for others before me. Instead, records mattered, dates mattered, exact words mattered, calm mattered. The community changed too. People didn't just move on, they paid attention. New board meetings were fuller. Questions were sharper. Residents asked where authority came from, not just how it was exercised. Financial statements were requested. Decisions were slowed down and explained. No one wanted another situation like this to slip through unchecked. That was the real resolution. Not fun, not resignations, not even the patrols being gone. It was awareness. Standing in my yard one evening, I realized something simple and powerful. The HOA hadn't lost control because someone loudly. They lost control because their authority couldn't survive the light, and the fence, unchanged, unmoved, became a quiet reminder of that truth. Boundaries don't need to shout, they just need to be real. When I look back on everything that happened, the biggest lesson isn't about HOAs or fences or even authority. It's about proof, because authority without proof isn't leadership. It isn't order, it's intimidation wearing a uniform. From the start, they expected noise. They expected anger. They expected me to argue, to lose patience, to make a mistake they could point at later. That's how pressure usually wins. Not by being right, but by being exhausting. What they didn't expect was calm. Every time I slowed down instead of reacting, the situation changed. Every time I asked for documents instead of raising my voice, the truth got closer. Calm didn't make things weaker, it made them clearer, and clarity is something intimidation can't survive. Now the land feels like mine again, not because it ever stopped being mine, but because it's respected again. The lights are gone. The patrols are gone. The quiet has returned in a way that feels earned. Not fragile, not temporary. The fence still stands exactly where it always has, but now it doesn't feel like a point of conflict. It feels like what it was meant to be from the beginning. A boundary, simple, honest, unchallenged. If you're watching this and you've dealt with an HOA that overstepped, pressured you, or made you feel small in your own space, you're not alone. These stories are more common than people think, and most of them stay quiet because people are pushed to comply before they ever get answers. If you've been through something like that, share your story in the comments. Someone else reading it might need to know they're not crazy for questioning authority that won't explain itself. And if you want more stories like this, real situations where patience, records, and truth lead to justice, make sure you subscribe. These aren't stories about revenge. They're about boundary, about knowing your rights, and about what happens when power is forced to answer simple questions. They thought a fence was just wood and wire. I knew it was a line they had no right to cross.